The shuttle hit the atmosphere of Cathara 7 at the wrong angle, and Elena Vasquez knew they were going to crash before her mother even started screaming. She remembered the fire outside the windows, the terrible shaking that threw her against her safety straps, and then the world went black and silent and cold. When Elena opened her eyes, she was alone. The shuttle had broken into pieces during the crash, and she found herself lying in thick purple grass under an alien sky with 3 moons hanging above her like watching eyes. Her head hurt and her arm was bleeding, but she was alive, and that felt like a miracle she did not deserve. "Mom," she called out, her voice weak and shaking. "Dad." No answer came back to her. Elena was 12 years old, the daughter of 2 famous xenobiologists who had spent their lives studying alien creatures across the galaxy. She had grown up on research stations and colony ships, learning about dangerous animals the way other children learned about mathematics and history. Her parents had always told her that knowledge was the best weapon against fear, and now she tried to remember everything they had taught her about Cathara 7. The planet was classified as extinction-level hostile, which meant that almost everything here could kill a human. The plants were often poisonous. The water needed to be filtered 3 times before drinking. And the apex predators were creatures called Vrakthan that had slaughtered entire colonial expeditions. Elena stood up slowly and looked around at the crash site. Pieces of the shuttle were scattered across a wide area of alien forest, some of them still smoking and sparking with broken electronics. She could see her emergency pack had survived, still attached to the piece of hull near where she had woken up. That was good because the pack contained food and water and medical supplies and a small knife. She limped over and grabbed the pack, then spent the next hour searching the crash site for her parents. She found her father's field journal, a thick book filled with notes about every planet he had ever visited. She found her mother's favorite jacket, torn but still warm. But she did not find her mother or her father, and she did not find any bodies either. That gave her hope, small and fragile but real. Maybe they had survived in another section of the shuttle, she told herself. Maybe they had landed somewhere else and were looking for her right now. Maybe rescue ships were already on their way. But the emergency beacon was destroyed, crushed under a piece of engine that had fallen on it during the crash. Without the beacon, no one would know where to look for them. The planet was huge and mostly unexplored, and Elena was just one small girl in an endless wilderness of danger. The sun was setting, painting the alien sky in colors of orange and deep purple. Elena knew she needed to find shelter before darkness came, because the field journal said that Vrakthan hunted mostly at night. She looked around and spotted a rocky hill about half a kilometer away, where dark openings suggested caves that might keep her safe. She started walking, clutching her pack and her father's journal, trying not to cry. The cave she found was larger than she expected, going deep into the rock with a ceiling high enough for her to stand. The entrance was partially hidden by thick vines with leaves that smelled sweet and slightly rotten. Elena pushed through them and stepped into the darkness, then stopped suddenly when she heard a sound. Growling, not one growl but several, coming from deeper in the cave. Elena's heart started pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She wanted to run, but her legs would not move, and her eyes were slowly adjusting to the dim light. She saw them. 4 creatures huddled together against the back wall of the cave, their eyes reflecting what little light came through the entrance. They were about the size of large dogs, covered in dark fur with patterns of lighter stripes. Their mouths were open, showing teeth that looked sharp enough to cut through metal. Vrakthan cubs. Elena's first instinct was to run, because even cubs could be deadly. But something made her stop and look more carefully at the creatures. They were thin, so thin that she could see their ribs pushing against their fur. One of them had a deep wound on its shoulder that looked infected and painful. Another was smaller than the rest, barely bigger than a house cat, and it was shaking with weakness or fear. Then she noticed what was lying at the cave entrance, half hidden by the vines she had pushed through. A dead adult Rakthon, massive and terrifying even in death. Its throat had been torn out, and the wounds suggested it had been killed by others of its own kind. This must have been the mother of the cubs, Elena realized. She had been killed by a rival pack, and now her children were alone and starving and dying. The cubs growled again, but Elena heard something different in the sound now. It was not the growl of predators preparing to attack. It was the sound of frightened children trying to seem brave. Elena thought about what her parents would do in this situation. Her mother would probably say that Rakthon could not be helped, that they were too dangerous and too wild. Her father would probably agree and tell her to find another cave. But Elena looked at those 4 pairs of frightened eyes, and she thought about how scared she was feeling herself. She was alone and hungry and hurt, and no one was coming to help her. These cubs were feeling exactly the same thing. She sat down slowly, making herself as small and unthreatening as possible. The cubs watched her with those glowing eyes, their growls becoming quieter. Elena opened her pack and pulled out one of her food rations, a block of compressed nutrients that did not taste very good but would keep her alive. She broke off a piece and tossed it toward the cubs. The smallest one, the one that was shaking, moved first. It crept forward on unsteady legs and sniffed the food, then grabbed it and retreated back to the others. The sick one with the wounded shoulder whimpered softly. Elena tossed another piece and another. By the time she had given away half her ration, the cubs had stopped growling completely. They were still watching her with caution, but the fear in their eyes had changed into something like curiosity. The largest cub, the one with pale gray fur that made it look like a ghost, took a few steps toward her. Elena held out her hand with a piece of food resting on her palm. The cub came closer, its nose twitching as it smelled her strange human scent. For a long moment, it just stood there, looking at her with eyes that seemed far too intelligent for a simple animal. Then it took the food from her hand, and its rough tongue brushed against her fingers. Elena smiled, and tears ran down her face at the same time. Outside the cave, the 3 moons rose higher into the alien sky. Somewhere in the jungle, the rival pack that had killed the cub's mother was hunting. The night was full of dangers that Elena could not even imagine. But inside the cave, a human girl and 4 predator cubs were sharing a meal. And something was beginning that the galaxy had never seen before. 3 days passed in the cave, and Elena learned that everything the scientists said about Rakthon was wrong. The galactic databases called them mindless killers with no capacity for emotional bonds. The research papers said their brains lacked the special receptors that allowed animals to form connections with other species. Every expert in the galaxy agreed that Rakthon could never be tamed or befriended or trusted. But those experts had never met Elena Vasquez. On the first morning, she woke up to find the smallest cub sleeping against her side, its tiny body pressed close to hers for warmth. The other 3 were watching her from across the cave, their eyes no longer filled with fear, but with something that looked almost like hope. Elena spent that day taking care of them. She used the antiseptic gel from her medical kit to clean the infected wound on the shoulder of the sick cub, even though it growled and snapped at her when the medicine stung. She shared her water, pouring it into a curved rock so they could all drink. She gave them more of her food rations, watching the strength slowly return to their starving bodies. By the second day, they had stopped flinching when she moved. The gray cub, the one she had started calling Ghost in her mind, would sit beside her and let her touch its fur. The wounded cub, which she named Scar because of the mark the injury would leave, followed her whenever she went to the cave entrance to look outside. The third cub had bright orange patterns in its fur that reminded her of fire, so she called it Ember. And the smallest one, the weak little creature that had been first to trust her, became Runt. You need proper names. Elena told him on the second night, sitting in the middle of the cave while all 4 cubs gathered around her. Ghost and Scar and Ember and Runt might not be very creative, but they suit you perfectly. The cubs could not understand her words, but they seemed to understand her voice. When she spoke softly, they relaxed. When she laughed, their ears would perk up with curiosity. When she cried, thinking about her missing parents, Runt would climb into her lap and press against her chest. Elena's father had written in his journal that Vrakthan communicated through sounds and scents and body movements. He had never considered that they might also communicate through something simpler and more powerful. They communicated through love. By the 3rd day, Elena knew that she could not stay in the cave any longer. Her food rations were almost gone, and the cubs needed more than she could provide. She remembered that there was a colonial outpost about 60 kilometers to the east, a research station where scientists studied the dangerous wildlife of Cathara 7. If she could reach it, she could find help for herself and maybe even for her new family. She looked at her father's field journal, studying the maps and notes he had made. The path to the outpost would take her through deep jungle filled with poisonous plants and dangerous creatures. She would need to cross 2 rivers and climb over a rocky ridge. It was a journey that would take at least 2 days, maybe 3 if she was careful. And then there was the biggest danger of all. The rival pack that had killed the cub's mother was still out there somewhere. Elena had heard them at night, their howls echoing through the darkness. They controlled most of the territory between the cave and the outpost, and they would not hesitate to kill anything that entered their hunting grounds. "I have to try," Elena said to the cubs, packing up her supplies and checking her knife. "I cannot keep you alive here, and I cannot survive alone forever." Ghost stood up and walked to the cave entrance, looking out at the jungle beyond. Then the gray cub looked back at Elena with those intelligent eyes, and she understood what it was trying to say. "We are coming with you." Elena wanted to tell them no, that it was too dangerous, that they should stay hidden in the cave. But she saw the determination in their eyes, all 4 of them standing together, ready to follow her wherever she went. They had decided that she was their pack now, and Vrakthan never abandoned their pack. She had not known that about them before. It was not in any of the research papers or scientific databases. But Elena understood it now, deep in her heart. "Okay," she said, smiling even though she was terrified. "We go together." They left the cave when the sun was highest, giving them maximum daylight for travel. Elena walked in front, using her father's journal to identify safe paths and avoid the most dangerous plants. The cubs spread out around her, their senses alert for threats she could not perceive. Twice during that first day, Ghost suddenly stopped and made a strange clicking sound. Both times, Elena froze and waited, and both times she saw something deadly pass nearby without noticing them. Once it was a snake-like creature with venomous fangs, slithering through the undergrowth. Once it was a swarm of insects that the journal said could strip flesh from bones in minutes. The cubs were protecting her, using abilities that humans did not have. When night came, they found shelter under a fallen tree, its massive trunk creating a small protected space. Elena did not sleep well, waking up every time she heard sounds in the darkness. But Ghost stayed awake all night, watching the jungle with eyes that could see in the dark. On the second day, they found the trail markers. Elena saw the first one in the morning, a tree with deep claw marks gouged into its bark. The scratches were fresh, and they were placed high on the trunk, higher than even a tall human could reach. A strong smell hung in the air, musky and unpleasant, making Scar and Ember growl nervously. "Territory markers," Elena whispered, recognizing them from her father's descriptions. "The Blood Maul pack is claiming this area." She looked at her map and felt her heart sink. The markers were exactly where they needed to go. There was no way around them, not without adding several days to their journey. They would have to pass through the hunting grounds of the pack that had killed the cub's mother. Runt pressed against Elena's legs, trembling. "I know," she said softly, reaching down to stroke the small cub's fur. "I am scared too." But what choice did they have? Going back meant starvation. Going around meant exhaustion and probably death from other dangers. The only path forward was through enemy territory, hoping that the Blood Mole pack would not find them. They moved more carefully now, stopping often to listen and smell the air. The cubs used their natural camouflage, their striped fur blending into the shadows of the jungle. Elena tried to be as quiet as possible, stepping where the cubs stepped, avoiding branches and leaves that might make noise. When evening came, she climbed a tall tree while the cubs hid in the roots below. From high above the ground, she could see farther and watch for approaching danger. That was when she saw the eyes. Glowing in the darkness, maybe 100 meters away, were dozens of eyes watching her tree. The Blood Mole pack had found them, and they were surrounding the area, cutting off any escape. Elena's whole body went cold with fear. She heard clicking sounds from below, and then Ghost appeared, climbing up the tree trunk to reach her. Adult Vracthen were too heavy to climb trees, but the cubs were still small enough to manage it. Ghost pressed against her side, and she could feel the young creature trembling. But the cub did not run away. It stayed with her, choosing to face death rather than abandon its human. In the darkness below, the Blood Mole pack began to circle closer, and Elena held Ghost tight against her chest as the longest night of her life began. The Blood Mole pack did not attack that night, and Elena did not understand why. She spent hours in the tree, watching the glowing eyes circle in the darkness below. Ghost stayed pressed against her side, and she could hear Scar and Ember and Runt hiding in the roots, making soft sounds of fear. The adult Vracthen moved like shadows, their massive bodies silent despite their size, communicating with clicks and growls that Elena could not interpret. They were testing her, she realized. Predators often studied their prey before attacking, looking for weaknesses, waiting for the perfect moment. The Blood Mole pack was trying to understand what kind of creature had entered their territory, and they were confused. Elena could see it in the way they moved, circling closer and then retreating, approaching from one direction and then another. She did not smell like any animal they had hunted before. She did not run or hide or fight back in ways they recognized. And strangest of all, she was traveling with 4 cubs that should have been their natural enemies. When the first light of dawn appeared on the horizon, the glowing eyes disappeared. The pack retreated into the deeper jungle, and Elena finally allowed herself to breathe. "They are gone," she whispered to Ghost. "For now." She climbed down from the tree on shaking legs, and the cubs immediately surrounded her. Scar was limping, the wounded shoulder hurting again after a night of tension. Ember kept looking toward the jungle, ears flat against its head. Runt would not stop trembling. Only Ghost seemed calm, standing tall and watching the direction where the pack had disappeared. Elena checked her supplies and felt her stomach twist with worry. She had 1 food ration left, barely enough for herself and nothing for the cubs. Her water was running low. The outpost was still at least a full day of walking away, and the Blood Mole pack now knew exactly where they were. "We have to keep moving," she told the cubs. Standing still means death. They walked faster than before, no longer trying to be quiet because silence had not protected them. Elena used every bit of knowledge from her father's journal, choosing paths that went through thick vegetation where adult Vracthen would have trouble moving quickly. The cubs stayed close to her, their fear making them more obedient than usual. Around midday, they found water. A small stream flowed through the jungle, its water clear and cool. Elena filled her container, using the filter from her survival pack to make it safe for drinking. The cubs drank directly from the stream, and she watched them with a mixture of love and fear. They trusted her so completely. They believed she could keep them safe, even though she was just a scared child herself. How could she protect them against 15 adult Racthan when she could barely protect herself? "My dad would know what to do," she said softly, sitting beside the stream while the cubs rested. "He always had a plan for everything." She opened the field journal and started reading, looking for anything that might help. Her father had studied Racthan for years, and his notes were filled with observations and theories. She read about their hunting patterns and their social structure and their territorial behavior. Then she found something interesting. Her father had written about a strange incident that happened during one of his research expeditions. A colonial worker had accidentally wandered into Racthan territory, and instead of running away, the man had panicked and charged toward the approaching predator. The Racthan had actually retreated, confused by behavior it had never encountered before. "On Kethera 7, everything runs from predators." Elena read from the journal. "The entire ecosystem is based on the principle that prey flees and predators chase. Nothing here has ever evolved the instinct to counterattack against a Racthan." She thought about that for a long time. Humans were not from Kethera 7. Humans had evolved on a completely different world with completely different rules. On Earth, her ancestors had faced lions and wolves and bears, predators that could be scared away by fire and noise and aggressive displays. Humans had learned that sometimes running was the wrong choice. Sometimes you had to stand your ground and fight. The afternoon passed too quickly, and soon the sun was getting lower. Elena pushed the cubs to move faster, knowing that darkness would bring the Bloodmaw pack back. The outpost was still several kilometers away, but she could see the rocky ridge that marked the final barrier. They were climbing the ridge when Scar suddenly stopped and made a warning sound. Elena turned and saw them. The Bloodmaw pack had followed them all day, staying hidden in the jungle shadows. Now, they were emerging into the open, 15 massive predators moving in a coordinated formation. At the front was the largest Racthan Elena had ever seen, a female with scars covering her face and shoulders, her eyes burning with intelligent hatred. The alpha of the Bloodmaw pack had decided it was time to end this. "Run!" Elena screamed at the cubs. "Climb the ridge!" They ran, scrambling over rocks and through narrow passages that slowed the adult Racthan behind them. Ghost led the way, finding paths that only small creatures could use. Ember and Scar followed close behind, their fear giving them speed they should not have had. But Runt was too slow. The smallest cub was still weak from days of starvation, and its legs could not move fast enough. Elena looked back and saw Runt falling behind, saw the alpha female getting closer with every second. She made a decision without thinking. Elena stopped running. She turned around and faced the approaching predator, her small human body standing directly in the path of the most dangerous creature on the planet. The alpha female slowed, surprised by this unexpected behavior. Elena screamed at her. Not a scream of fear, but a scream of pure rage, the battle cry of a species that had conquered an entire world. She picked up rocks and threw them at the alpha, making herself look as big and threatening as possible. She waved her arms and stomped her feet and shouted words that meant nothing but sounded terrifying. The alpha stopped completely. In 10 million years of evolution on Kethera 7, nothing had ever done this. Every creature the Racthan had ever hunted ran away. Every animal on this planet knew that standing still meant death. But this strange small creature was not standing still. It was actually moving closer. The alpha's instincts had no response to this situation. For 3 precious seconds, the most powerful predator on Kethera 7 hesitated, trying to understand what was happening. And in those 3 seconds, Ghost and Scar and Ember attacked. The 3 cubs threw themselves at the alpha, not because they thought they could win, but because their human needed time. They bit and scratched and clawed, small bodies fighting against a monster twice their size. Blood flew through the air. Some of it from the alpha, most of it from the cubs. Elena grabbed Runt and ran. She did not look back to see what happened to the others. She could not afford to look back, could not afford to slow down. She climbed the ridge with Runt pressed against her chest, her legs burning with exhaustion, her heart screaming at her to go back for the others. Then she heard sounds behind her, and Ghost appeared. The gray cub was covered in blood, limping badly, one ear torn, almost completely off. But Ghost was alive, and moments later Scar and Ember came scrambling over the rocks, wounded but still moving. They had survived. The Blood Maul pack was regrouping below, the alpha howling with rage at the prey that had escaped. Elena held her cubs close and cried with relief, and she saw something different in their eyes now. They had learned something new, something their species had never understood. They had learned that courage was not about strength. It was about love. Elena sat on top of the ridge as darkness fell, holding her wounded family close. Ghost's ear was bleeding badly, and she used the last of her medical supplies to stop the flow. Scar had new cuts on top of old wounds, and Ember was limping from a bite on its back leg. Only Runt was uninjured, the smallest cub having been saved by Elena's desperate stand against the alpha. "I should have been faster," Elena whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I should have protected you better." But the cubs did not blame her. They pressed against her body, seeking comfort and warmth, their trust in her completely unchanged. Ghost licked her hand with a rough tongue, and she saw no anger in those intelligent eyes, only love. Below the ridge, she could hear the Blood Maul pack howling. They had not given up the hunt, and they knew exactly where their prey had gone. The ridge would slow them down but not stop them, and by morning, they would find a way up. Elena looked east and saw something that made her heart jump. Lights! Tiny points of brightness in the darkness, maybe 2 or 3 kilometers away. The colonial outpost was right there, so close she could almost touch it. If she could reach it before dawn, she would be safe. "We have to go now," she told the cubs. "We have to move while they are still trying to find a path up the ridge." The cubs were exhausted and wounded, barely able to stand. But they followed her anyway, trusting that she knew what she was doing. Elena carried Runt in her arms because the smallest cub was too weak to keep pace. Ghost walked beside her, the gray cub ignoring its pain to stay close to its human. They moved through the night, using the lights of the outpost as a guide. The terrain was easier on this side of the ridge, with fewer rocks and more open ground. But easier terrain also meant the Blood Maul pack would move faster once they found a way across. Elena pushed herself harder than she had ever pushed before. Her legs screamed with pain, her lungs burned with every breath, and her arms ached from carrying Runt. But she did not stop, did not slow down, did not allow herself to think about how tired she was. Halfway to the outpost, she heard the howls getting closer. The pack had crossed the ridge. Elena looked back and saw shadows moving in the moonlight, massive shapes running with a speed that nothing human could match. The alpha female was leading them, her rage driving her forward like a storm. "Faster," Elena gasped, trying to run. "We have to go faster." But there was no faster left in any of them. The cubs were limping and stumbling, their wounded bodies failing them. Elena's own legs were like dead weights, refusing to obey her commands. The outpost lights were still a kilometer away, and the pack was closing the distance with terrifying speed. They were not going to make it. Elena's mind raced, trying to think of something, anything that might save them. She looked at the terrain around her and saw a small hill with rocks at the top, maybe 100 meters ahead. It was not much, but it would give them high ground. "There!" she shouted, pointing toward the hill. "We make our stand there." The cubs understood. They ran for the hill with the last of their strength, climbing the rocks and turning to face the approaching pack. Elena put Runt down and picked up the biggest stone she could find, holding it like a weapon. The blood maw pack surrounded the hill, their eyes glowing in the darkness. The alpha female stood at the front, her scarred face twisted with hatred. She made a series of clicking sounds, and the pack began to close in from all sides. 15 against 5, Elena thought. 4 wounded cubs and 1 exhausted human girl against the most dangerous predators on the planet. There was no escape, no rescue, no hope. But she remembered what she had learned earlier that day. She remembered that courage was not about winning. It was about standing up when everything seemed lost. "Come on then," Elena screamed at the pack. "You want us, come and take us." She threw her rock at the alpha, hitting the massive predator right between the eyes. The alpha snarled with pain and anger, but Elena was already picking up another rock, already screaming again. Ghost joined her, standing at the edge of the hill and making sounds Elena had never heard before. Not growls of fear, but something else entirely, something that sounded almost like a challenge. Scar and Ember added their voices, and even little Runt tried to look fierce. The pack hesitated. They had seen prey fight back before, but never like this. This was not the desperate struggle of animals trying to escape. This was something different, something that felt almost like defiance. The alpha charged. Elena braced herself for the impact, knowing she had no chance of surviving. But Ghost moved faster, the gray cub throwing itself at the alpha with a ferocity that seemed impossible for such a small creature. Scar and Ember joined the attack, all 3 cubs fighting together against a monster that outweighed them by hundreds of pounds. The alpha threw them aside like toys, but they got back up and attacked again. And again. And again. They were not trying to win, Elena realized. They were buying her time, sacrificing themselves so she might live a few moments longer. These cubs that she had saved were now dying for her. "No!" she screamed, running toward the fight. "Stop it! Leave them alone." She hit the alpha with her bare fists, punching and kicking with all her human fury. The predator turned toward her, its jaws opening wide, and Elena saw death coming for her. Then the night exploded with light and sound. Pulse rifles fired from the darkness, their energy bolts striking the ground around the pack. Bright floodlights activated, turning night into day. Human voices shouted orders, and Elena heard the most beautiful sound in the galaxy. The Blood Maw pack was running. The Colonial Defense Patrol had found them. Somehow, impossibly, the humans from the outpost had come to rescue her. Elena fell to her knees as soldiers in armored suits surrounded the hill, their weapons tracking the fleeing predators. But she was not looking at the soldiers. She was looking at Ghost and Scar and Ember, 3 small bodies lying bloody and broken on the ground. Runt was pressing against her leg, whimpering with fear and grief. "Please," Elena sobbed, crawling toward her cubs. "Please do not be dead. Please." Ghost moved first, lifting that torn ear and looking at her with exhausted eyes. Then Scar, coughing but breathing. Then Ember, whining softly but alive. They were not dead. They were hurt badly, but they were not dead. Elena gathered all 4 cubs in her arms, holding them against her chest, crying so hard she could not see. The soldiers approached with their weapons ready, and she heard one of them speak. "Command, you are not going to believe this. We found a survivor, a child, and she has 4 Vrakthan with her. They are not attacking her. They are protecting her. I repeat, wild Vrakthan are protecting a human girl." There was a long pause, then a voice from the radio said something that sounded like disbelief. Elena did not care about the voices or the soldiers or anything else. She only cared about the 4 heartbeats she could feel against her own, the 4 lives that had fought and bled and almost died because they loved her. "Thank you," she whispered to them. "Thank you for not giving up on me." Ghost pressed closer, and Elena felt a rough tongue lick away her tears. The Colonial Outpost Medical Bay was not designed for Rackham patients, but the doctors did their best. Elena refused to be treated until her cubs were stable, and no one could convince her to leave their side. She sat in a corner of the veterinary section, watching as scientists and medical officers worked on Ghost and Scar and Ember. Runt stayed in her lap, too small for a separate bed. "This is impossible," one of the xenobiologists kept saying. "Rackham do not form bonds outside their own species. Their brain structure simply does not allow it." But the evidence was lying right in front of him. When the doctors approached Ghost to examine the torn ear, the gray cub made threatening sounds until Elena came closer and touched its fur. When Scar needed painful treatment for the infected shoulder wound, the cub only calmed down when Elena held its paw. Ember would not eat unless Elena offered the food. They imprinted on her, another scientist said with amazement. Like baby birds imprinting on their mother. But this should not be possible with Rackham. Elena did not care about what should or should not be possible. She only cared that her family was going to survive. It took 3 days for the cubs to recover enough to stand on their own. Ghost's ear would always be torn, leaving a distinctive mark. Scar now had even more scars covering its body. Ember walked with a slight limp that might never fully heal. But they were alive, and they followed Elena wherever she went. The outpost commander did not know what to do with them. "They are dangerous predators," he argued during a meeting that Elena insisted on attending. "We cannot keep them in a human settlement. It goes against every safety regulation." "They saved my life," Elena replied, her voice calm but firm. "More than once. They fought a whole pack to protect me. If you send them away, they will die." "The child has a point," said the chief scientist, a woman named Dr. Rajan, who had spent 20 years studying Cathura 7. "What we are seeing here is unprecedented. These cubs have bonded with a human in ways we never thought possible. Sending them back into the wild would be cruel and would also waste an incredible scientific opportunity." The debate continued for hours, but Elena knew she would win. The cubs were sitting around her feet the whole time, their presence a constant reminder that they belonged with her. On the 5th day, rescue ships finally reached the second section of the crashed shuttle. Elena was in the medical bay when the news came, and she ran faster than she had ever run in her life. She burst through the outpost doors just as the transport landed, and she saw 2 figures climbing out. Her mother. Her father. They were injured but alive, having survived by hiding in the shuttle wreckage until help arrived. Elena crashed into their arms, crying and laughing at the same time, and for a long moment she was just a little girl who had found her parents again. Then Ghost and Scar and Ember and Runt came running up behind her, and Elena's parents saw what their daughter had done. "Elena," her mother whispered, staring at the 4 predators sitting peacefully at her daughter's feet. "What have you done?" "I saved them," Elena said simply. "And they saved me." Her father knelt down slowly, his scientist's eyes examining the cubs with wonder. Ghost allowed him to come close, though the gray cubs stayed between Elena and any potential threat. Scar watched with those intelligent eyes, and Ember leaned against Elena's legs. "Incredible," her father said softly. "They have completely accepted you as pack. I have studied these creatures for 15 years, and I never believed this was possible." "The research papers say Rackham cannot bond," Elena replied. "But the research papers are wrong. They can bond. They just needed someone to give them a chance." News of Elena's story spread quickly across the galaxy. Scientists came from dozens of worlds to study her and her unusual family. They wrote papers about neuroplasticity and behavioral imprinting and cross-species social bonding. They measured brain waves and hormone levels and 100 other things that Elena did not understand. But they all missed the point. The scientists wanted to explain what had happened with chemicals and neurons and evolutionary biology. They wanted to reduce Elena's bond with the cubs to something mechanical, something that could be replicated in a laboratory. They did not understand that love was not about science. When Elena had found those 4 starving cubs in the cave, she had not thought about neural receptors or imprinting mechanisms. She had seen children who needed help, and she had helped them. When she had stood against the alpha female, she had not calculated her chances of survival. She had protected someone she loved, even though it meant facing death. That was the human way. Humans did not form bonds because their brains told them to. They formed bonds because their hearts did. They loved not because it was logical, but because love was the most powerful force in the universe. 6 months later, Elena's family was still living on Kethra 7, helping to establish the first successful research program for human-Rakhthan cooperation. Other cubs were being introduced to human caretakers, though none of them bonded as quickly or as deeply as Elena's 4. Ghost had grown almost to adult size, but the grave Rakhthan still slept curled around Elena every night. Scar had become protective of Elena's parents, especially her father, who often worked late in the field. Ember loved to play, chasing balls and toys like a giant puppy. And Runt, no longer the smallest, had become the bravest of them all, always the first to explore new things. One evening, Elena sat on a hill overlooking the outpost, watching the 3 moons rise into the alien sky. Ghost lay beside her, and the other 3 cubs were scattered nearby, enjoying the cool night air. A famous xenobiologist had visited that day, wanting to interview Elena for a documentary about her experience. He had asked her many questions, but one stood out in her mind. "What made you approach those cubs instead of running away?" he had asked. Any rational being would have fled from predators. Elena had thought about the question for a long time before answering. "When I saw them in that cave, I did not see predators," she had said finally. "I saw 4 frightened children who had lost their mother. They were alone and scared and hungry, just like me. How could I run away from that?" The scientist had written down her words, but Elena did not think he really understood. Humans were not special because they were strong or fast or smart. Other species in the galaxy were stronger, faster, smarter. What made humans special was something much simpler. Humans saw pain and wanted to fix it. They saw fear and wanted to comfort it. They saw loneliness and wanted to end it. Even when it was dangerous, even when it was irrational, even when it went against every instinct of self-preservation. That was what it meant to be human. Ghost lifted that torn ear and looked at Elena with eyes full of trust and love. In those eyes, she saw reflected everything she had become over the past months. She was still a 12-year-old girl, still scared sometimes, still missing the life she had known before the crash. But she was also pack mother to 4 incredible creatures. She was proof that love could bridge any gap. She was the human girl who had looked at monsters and seen only children who needed her. And that, Elena knew, was worth more than all the scientific papers in the galaxy. The 3 moons rose higher, casting silver light across the alien landscape. Somewhere in the jungle, the Blood Mole pack was hunting, their territory now marked to avoid the area around the outpost. The night was full of dangers and wonders and mysteries still waiting to be discovered. But on that small hill, surrounded by her unusual family, Elena Vasquez was home.